What's up, guys? Welcome back to American History. This is the lecture for Tuesday, March 31st. Glad you're tuning in. We are going to just pick up right where we left off yesterday. Yesterday, we talked about the definitions of segregation, forms of segregation and discrimination, and how that sets the tone for the civil rights movement. So, to go over just a few more ways that this era is affected by racial tensions. So, a common place for discrimination was through employment. Back in the early 1900s, even through the mid 1900s, the workforce was known for hiring minorities, specifically African Americans. They were being hired for the very lowest positions in firms and businesses and industries and things like that. So bottom of the rung means you're getting also bottom paycheck, like bottom salary. So, and people will counter that with, well, they didn't have the education that others had. And I counter that with, well, what's the reason? Oh, because schools are underfunded and the minority population, whether it's Hispanic or African American, or in the West Coast case, Asian immigrants, they are being left with very limited, if any, opportunities to, advance or to grow in an educational way or to be given those opportunities. And we see a little bit of that still today. Certain cities especially have an issue with, inner city schools being poorly funded, poorly taken care of, and, being left for no one to care for. And then these opportunities, nowadays, it's considered a success story if a student makes it out of, South Central Los Angeles High School. And that, whereas, it's not considered a wonderful success story when a student graduates Chaparral High School and goes to college. It's great, but it's not considered out of the norm. And if we're teaching generally the same thing using similar methods, what's the biggest difference? Well, it's the exposure and the opportunities that those people are given. And then, we tell them, well, you're not qualified for these other jobs. Well, it's because they haven't been given the training and the experience beforehand. So that's where the issues of the past kind of meld into the issues of today. But back to early 1900s, the African Americans especially were considered people that were the last to be hired, but the first to be fired. They're kind of last ditch effort. Well, if no one else is applying for this bottom tier job, then we'll hire so and so. And then when cuts are to be made, well, we can't keep the lowest worker. We can't keep the only African American here, because if we fire white people before we fire the only African American, then there will be an outrage amongst the white people. And I'm not saying like all white people are that way, but at this time that was kind of the school of thought, and that's where these issues kind of arise from. Along with that, the standard of living, I kind of dove into that when I talked about education. Standard of living was just lower and different. Illiteracy was clouding a lot of these cities or townships that had a a high number of minority people because school wasn't as big of a deal. It wasn't pushed. It wasn't as beneficial to some people. And that leads to poverty because they can't get an education, they can't get a job, and they can't make money. And then they turn to whether it's unhealthy lifestyles or dangerous lifestyles, and it leads to shorter life expectancy. Like, this is all just a complete cycle, a chain reaction that affects all types of people. It just happened to be affecting African Americans more than the rest. And then, as we talked about, a form of the de facto segregation was housing. The fact that they would withhold property or withhold houses from people because they're African American and it was a white neighborhood. Now, this takes us through World War II, and at the end of World War II, a lot of African Americans back home saw, well, we defeated this, racist and anti-Semitic monster in Adolf Hitler, and his blonde hair, blue eyes theology. And so surely we see the error of our own ways. Surely we will come out of this realizing, hey, we don't want to be anything like that guy, so let's turn things around. But while there may have been a tiny bit of progression and improvement, it was not near enough to really appease the people. So we're going to back it up a little bit. The civil rights movement is credited with starting in the mid 50s and taking place in the 60s. Now, civil rights has been going on forever. The majority of the groundbreaking and change-making civil rights happens in the 50s and 60s, but those movements don't happen without the groundwork being laid. And the groundwork being laid starts in 1905 with the Niagara movement, which takes place obviously in Niagara Falls, actually on the Canadian side, because they felt like if they held it on the American side, they'd be banished or the meeting would be crashed. So they held it in Canada, where Canada didn't really hate anybody. They're just indifferent to everyone. And this movement's led by a number of people. The biggest name is probably a man by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. That's French. He's American, but he's got French ancestry, so that's how you pronounce his last name. And William Monroe Trotter. Those were the two biggest advocates for this. Now, this is a movement that is created off of the ideals of a man named Booker T. Washington. Maybe you've heard of him. He's a very influential African American. He's from, is it Tulsa, Oklahoma? He's from somewhere in Oklahoma. And he's extremely famous and maybe one of the most well-known civil rights activists. But this Niagara movement was created in opposition to Booker T. Washington, which is strange. There's a rivalry here. Du Bois and Trotter and many others at this movement were advocates for, well, actually, first of all, Booker T. Washington was an advocate for compliance and peace. He said he wanted people to stop getting worked up over all this stuff. He said, let's just take what we got and let's not feud with white people. Let's not try and rile things up. Don't stir the pot. Let's try and be civil, and let's educate ourselves and take some time to educate our people. And then we can kind of mold ourselves into this civilized society where we're all equal, kind of force our way in diplomatically. Well, Dubois and Trotter were not fans of that. They said that's not going to work. We tried that in the 1870s and 1880s, and we just got lynched over and over, especially in the South. So we need to change that. That's not going to work. So Dubois and Trotter pushed this movement, not as a form of like militancy, like they're going to be violent, but they said that could be a possibility. But this is going to be a movement that's going to need to accelerate quickly. It's going to need to pick up pace, and we're going to have to force the government's hands of equality, or in terms of gaining equality. That's all they want. If you look up like the demands that were created by the Niagara movement, I got a list of demands that they wanted. All of them are, by today's standards, perfectly reasonable. And by today's standards, for the most part, they're mostly accomplished, not 100%. But the demands at that time were considered outlandish. What, you want the right to vote and not be intimidated when you show up to the polls? That's ludicrous. Well, you want to be seen as equals in the eyes of the law? You want to be given the same punishment for a crime as a white person? That's ridiculous. That's where we were back in 1905. And Washington and Dubois just bickered over it. Like, it was a big issue between the two of them. And the Niagara movement kind of falls apart within the next 4 years. Trotter and Dubois actually have kind of a falling out themselves, and the big reason why was because of their ideals on whether or not women should be allowed to join the movement. Dubois thought women should be, and Trotter did not. So even then, I mean, you see the difference in the times, in how people thought. Even during the civil rights movement, people are, campaigning for the rights of African American men, but then half of those men are not in favor of women gaining equal rights. So that causes a split, and the movement falls apart. Now, in 1909, the creation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, that is kind of a compromise made between the followers of Booker T. Washington and Dubois. Now, Washington and Dubois never really joined forces and become allies. Washington dies in 1915. But this was kind of a compromise of we are going to, try and push the envelope, try and push along this or accelerate this movement, but we're going to try and do it calmly and not rile people and ruffle feathers. So that is where the civil rights movement, I wouldn't say really starts, but that's where the 20th century civil rights movement takes off. Now, some people that were involved in that movement, Jane Addams, if you remember from the the American Industrialization chapter, Jane Addams is the creator of Hull House, which is that community center basically in Chicago for the poor or for the financially struggling. She also lends her support to African American rights, and they go to the courts to try and challenge some of these unfair, whether they're racist laws or just standard ways of life that weren't on the books but were being enforced. Ray Stannard Baker was a journalist that wrote a book following the plight of the African American person pursuing the right to vote. So some developments here. The Urban League is created in 1911. That was like the first workers' union for African Americans. Think back to labor unions, they were still extremely young here and not all that effective, but it was a start in the right direction. I forgot to mention, back to the um, Niagara movement. The person who funded that event, the person who paid for that meeting, was a man known by the name of Andrew Carnegie. If you think back to, again, the industrial chapter, Carnegie is the one that actually, he's one of the two richest Americans who ever lived. He was a pretty big supporter of civil rights, even way back then, even before it was cool. So kudos to Andrew Carnegie. Now, in the 1920s, a man by the name of Marcus Garvey creates what was known as the Pan-African movement, or Pan-Africanism, but he called it the Back to Africa movement, which was, he's an African-American, and he believes that we've tried 50 years, 60 years now that African-Americans have been freed and not technically enslaved, and we still can't come to an agreement on, treatment and how to be civilized. So how about us African Americans, how about we just go settle a colony in Africa and move and live there, and we'll voluntarily segregate ourselves. That's essentially what this Pan-Africanism movement was. And that is an interesting idea on paper. Also an idea that was kind of already happening. If you remember the talks behind the country Liberia in Africa, which is created by James Madison, I believe it was. Or no, sorry, James Monroe, excuse me. Created by President James Monroe as a freed colony, or as a colony of freed slaves. Now, I think Garvey was looking for something a little bigger and more substantial. But he tried, and he had a decent amount of followers and people that believed it, but it never really took off. It never gained a ton of traction because it's not that easy just to uproot and leave. You show up to whatever colony. I think he talked about either a place in Africa or Jamaica. You show up there and you've got no money and no opportunities and no idea of what to do. Whereas in America, you have no money, but you have possibly ideas on how to dig yourself out of whatever hole you'd be in. So a lot of people didn't follow that necessarily, but it was an interesting idea and something that other movements built off of. Now, in 1930, the Nation of Islam is created by Elijah Muhammad. Now, this is a branch of the Islamic faith, but it is, on the surface, different. Like, Nation of Islam is like 99.8% African American. It's still around today. Today's membership is nowhere near as big as it was. I think like in the 60s was probably its peak, which also, no coincidence, happens to be the peak of the civil rights movement itself. But the Nation of Islam is created, and Elijah Muhammad is one of the co-founders. He's actually the second leader of it. And he's in charge for, I think, 35 years, 40 years. And he's extremely popular amongst his people. Like, the Nation of Islam got membership by basically preaching about the evils of white people and how all these white Americans are Christians or some branch of Christianity, and they preach intolerance, and they have held us down for all this time. So we need to counter that with our own faith, and so they follow the Islamic faith, and it turns into almost like a hate group. And that's not Islam itself, but the Nation of Islam had many followers that preached hatred against white people and against Jewish people and really any outsiders. So they decide to fight intolerance and hatred. They are going to use intolerance and hatred, fighting fire with fire. And it's very confrontational and controversial. Some of the most famous members of the Nation of Islam include people like Malcolm X, who's the leader of it, and a man by the name of Muhammad Ali was a member of the Nation of Islam. And it adds more fuel to this fire. They really attacked any kind of cooperation with white people and white government. And it sets a stage for quite a bit of opposition and confrontation. So today's essential question is, what person do you think was most influential in starting the civil rights movement, and why? That's important. Include why, don't just give me a name. So of the people we talked about, and possibly if you know of people that we didn't talk about in today's lecture, if you know some or do some research and find someone else we glossed over, and you can mention them. But who, in your opinion, there is no right or wrong answer as long as it's someone that was actually involved in the civil rights movement. Who do you think was most influential in starting the civil rights movement? And in starting, I mean probably pre-1950. Someone like Martin Luther King, I wouldn't say is a wrong answer, but Martin Luther King more accelerates the civil rights movement to a great deal, but he more accelerates. He doesn't so much start it. So what you're going to do is go to Google Classroom and open up the assignment from yesterday, where hopefully you answered yesterday's essential question. Just go down a couple lines, type out this question, and answer it on that same document. And then at the end of the week, you should have 5 questions, 5 answers on that one document. You'll turn it in, and you'll get credit for attendance. So what person do you think was most influential in starting the civil rights movement, and why? Thank you guys for tuning in. Hope you learned something. We will be back again tomorrow, another pre-recorded lecture. Thursday will be our Zoom meeting, which will then also turn into another lecture. So, all right, guys, thank you very much. Stay safe. Wash your hands. I know how nasty some of you guys are. Stay clean, stay healthy, and stay busy. Have a good one, guys.